Oh, the promise and the oath you swore have been painted red over my door.
Welcome to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, welcome back to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and I'm here as always with Bill Schofield and with John Harrigan. Hey guys, how's it going?
Going great.
Doing well.
Great. Well, it's great to be with you guys as always, and listeners, it's always great to have you with us for another episode. Last week, we started our look at the Ketuvim after taking a good section on the prophets, the Nevi'im, and this week we want to continue looking specifically at the Psalms. But let's do a quick little review.
Yeah, so, we covered the former and latter prophets of the Nevi'im and the minor prophets from Joshua through 1st and 2nd Kings, the former prophets, and then the latter prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then the 12 minor prophets, and how this was projected forward. The narrative and the themes are projected forward into apocalyptic thought and literature and become the basis of the worldview of the New Testament that we read there.
Yeah, and having wrapped up the Nevi'im, last week we started on the section in the Hebrew Bible known as the Ketuvim, or the writings, from katav, which is verb for write. So the Ketuvim, the writings, we started last week. We started looking at some of the wisdom literature and the role that wisdom literature generally has played in both the academic conversation about the development of apocalyptic literature and additionally just how it represents kind of some early convictions about apocalyptic themes throughout sections like Psalms and Proverbs, as they assume scenarios that are later generally attributed to apocalyptic writers, scenarios of an end-time recompense with an afterlife and life and death and an end-time calamity coming to the people of Israel, reward and punishment, everlasting life, etc. And so we started to see the role that wisdom literature plays in kind of developing what later would become a full-on apocalyptic tradition in Second Temple Judaism.
Well, and you say conclusion, though we still have plenty more episodes to talk about the Ketuvim.
Right.
But today we have a very, very special guest to help us intro our section here on the Ketuvim. And today's guest is David Mitchell. David Mitchell is a biblical scholar. He's a musicologist, and he has a doctorate in Hebrew Bible from Edinburgh University and a master's in biblical interpretation from London School of Theology. And some of his major publications include one work we're going to be talking about specifically today, his first major one called The Message of the Psalter, an Eschatological Programme in the Book of Psalms, and The Songs of Ascent, which he released in 2015, and his two most recent works, Messiah ben Joseph, and his most recent one, Jesus, the Incarnation of the Word. And even though David has functioned as an academic theologian in the past, his musical interest led him to choose the career path of a pastoral musician. And we're going to talk about that with David a little bit on today's show. But for the last 16 years, he's been the director of music in Holy Trinity Pro Cathedral in Brussels in Belgium. So David, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you.
Hello, Josh. Hello, Bill. Hello, John. Lovely to be here.
Well, as we jump in today, could you give our listeners some of your story and your journey into the world of biblical academia? And in particular, what was it that prompted your interest in the book of Psalms?
Right. Well, talking about myself, you've already got my bio, so I'll try not to repeat what's there. But for most of my life, since my 20s, I've been a pastoral musician in one way or another. I was a school teacher for 8 years, but even when I was doing that, I was always playing in the local church and so on. So that always came very naturally to me. For the last 16 years, I've been director of music full-time at Holy Trinity, Brussels. That's the Anglican Cathedral of the Diocese of Europe. I'm kept pretty busy in Holy Trinity with singers and choirs and orchestras and instruments and music scores and recordings. And I have the great joy of leading big choral orchestral events. I love doing that many times a year. So we do the Bach Passions, we do Handel's Messiah, we do Mozart Haydn Masses. We did a Mozart Mass this last Sunday. We do huge Christmas carol services with 1,000 people in the big Brussels Cathedral. But we also do contemporary praise and worship, and we do everything in between. So I love music, and I love being able to lead that stuff and round them all up and point them in the same direction. That's comes very naturally to me. My story is that, well, how far back do I go? Let me go backwards. When I finished my PhD in Hebrew Bible, I had the choice of becoming an academic theologian or a pastoral musician. And I guess initially I thought of doing the academic theologian thing, but I don't know. The more I thought about it, what came naturally to me was being a pastoral musician, because the Psalms are full of the director of music. And if you want to live this, what do you do? Well, you become a director of music. So in the end, I turned down a good offer of a postdoctoral scholarship, and I chose the path of being a pastoral musician. And what swayed me was my desire to put into action what I'd learned from the Psalms about the importance of praise. And there was also the feeling that I'd rather leave the world some beautiful music than a few dry theological articles. However, these days I seem to be doing as much theology as I do music, but I hope my theology is not as dry as I feared it might have been back then. I suppose after doing 3.5 years of a PhD, I was kind of struck by the dryness of a lot of academic theology. The problem is not with academic theology. The problem is with academic theologians who've lost their first love, and with scholars who don't know how to communicate. But I try and do my best to communicate simply, and I try and glorify God in what I write. So you want to go back a bit further? Let's keep going backwards. My name is David Mitchell, and I have a doctorate in Hebrew Bible from Edinburgh University. I was supervised there by Ian Provan, who's now the professor in Vancouver, and by Professors John Gibson, Peter Heyman, and John O'Neill. Before that, I had a master's in biblical interpretation from London School of Theology, and I have a degree in English literature and music. Now, what prompted my interest in the book of Psalms? Well, my interest in the Psalms goes back a long way. I first came to a living Christian faith around about 1980, when I was 20, 21. And it came as a result of reading the Bible. And there were 3 books in particular in the Bible that I read. That was Genesis and John's Gospel and the Psalms. And there were several things about the Psalms that drew me. First of all, the Psalms give us an inner vision of the soul as it lives before God. You know, in the Torah, we read about the laws and how people are supposed to live. And in the historical books, we live about how people lived and how they fought and how they worshipped and how they died. But in the Psalms, we read about kings and prophets, but it's not describing their deeds. We actually get to read the very inner words of the soul of these kings and prophets. How they spoke to God, how they saw themselves before God. We see how David and Moses and Asaph saw themselves before God, and how they prayed, how they justified themselves to God in their joys and their sorrows and their victories and their feats, their virtues and their sins, their triumphs and their fears. And by their example, we learn to live before God in the same way, bringing him our troubles and waiting for his salvation. And then again, the Psalms model to us a life of praise. When King David became king, he was surrounded by enemies on every side. But he set up a ministry of praise singing to accompany the Tamid, the daily offering. And within a few years, his enemies on every side had backed off. He had rest on every side. And it seems to me that if we live lives of praise, we can also live lives of victory and rest and peace. And then I think finally I was interested in the role of music in the Psalms. Music has always seemed to me to be a divine language. I've always been puzzled why simple sequences of musical notes and rhythms can move our emotions as powerfully as they do. And I became interested in the whole question of musical praise in the history of the people of God. When I was finishing my degree in English literature, I was writing a dissertation on a group of hymns of the Scottish Reformation called the Good and Godly Ballads. And I was struck by how these hymn tunes in Old Scots had such a strong influence on the Scottish Reformation. And it seemed to me that musical praise was vital for church life in every way, for evangelism and for teaching and for unity and for fellowship. After all, you wouldn't go to a church without music. A church without music would not be a church. Paul says, be filled with the Spirit, speak to one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And so, if you want to be filled with the Spirit, musical praise and the fullness of the Spirit are inextricably linked. If music is missing, the Holy Spirit is absent. There would be something badly wrong with a church that has no music. And that is why hymnody has been central to the life of God's people for at least 3 millennia, or perhaps more. So I think that sums up my interest in the Psalms. It is this overlap of music and prayer and praise and theology. And out of this has grown all my different areas of interest. And it combines ancient history, prayer, praise, the power of the Spirit, the coming of the Messiah, the spiritual well-being of the believer, the believing community, archaeomusicology. These are all things that interest me, and they all kind of find their focus in the book of, or grow out of my interest in the book of Psalms.
That's great. And I think both John and Josh, you guys would agree that the first time we came across David's work, it was from his work in the Psalms, particularly his the book, The Message in the Psalter. And I remember David as a young man, when I first kind of developed the conviction that I wanted to have a faith that was real and could carry me through life and not just rely on the faith of my parents. I was raised on the mission field, as I mentioned to you before. But I remember early on deciding I was going to read a psalm a day. And I don't know where I got that from. To this day, I don't know a lot of people who around me who read a psalm a day. But I'm still in the practice. I still read a psalm a day. And so 30-something years later. But I remember even as a young man, 15, 16, right around there, however long it took me to get from Psalm 1 to Psalm 72, I remember being a little bit perplexed when I got to the end of Psalm 72 and going, okay, the Psalms of David are over. And then getting to Psalms, beyond that and going, oh, they're not over. And I figured I'll figure that out when I grow up. But so one of the and I had read, since then, some of the predominant theories leading up to the 20th century, and they seemed logical, although maybe didn't fully satisfy it. But there's so many answers. There's so many answers to questions about the redaction of the Tanakh and the Hebrew Bible. So I just accepted it, and And then I got my hands on the message of the Psalter. Yeah, which was, and I still remember I had a friend who was working. I was not in school at the time, and I had a friend who was working at a university library, and he checked out a copy for me, and I was able to take it home and digest it for a while, and I was very thankful. But so for our listeners who aren't aware, would you go into a little bit beyond just the value of the Psalms? Go into maybe the background of what prompted your particular suggestion that the Psalms, while it's generally acknowledged that they were redacted in some sense, or I guess that's not generally acknowledged, because the prior view was kind of that they were just built over time and they were added to, I guess. But so how did you come to the conviction that they were really redacted with a particular purpose, in contrast to the scholarship that was out there at the time?
Yeah, well, let's go back again. I began reading the Psalms when I was about 20, 21. I began reading them carefully, and I was fascinated by their language, and I kept wondering how it would be performed and sung. And I began to teach myself Hebrew so I could understand their poetry a bit better. And this led me, when I was 30, to do a master's in biblical interpretation. And then I wrote my dissertation, and I thought that I should write it on the Songs of Ascents. So that's the group of 15 Psalms from Psalm 120 to 134. And the more I read the Songs of Ascents, the more it became clear to me that there is a progression in these 15 Psalms. They form a story or a narrative. Someone is moving from trouble and sorrow to victory and praise. And when I'd finished this, I had to know more. So then I went and did a PhD in Hebrew studies in Edinburgh with the Psalms as my subject. Now, to say that the Songs of Ascents form a narrative is pretty easy because they seem to be a group. They're all called the Songs of Ascent, and it's not so hard to see that they would form some kind of progression. But to begin to apply that to the whole book of Psalms is a different thing. But I guess this was in the background of my mind. If the Songs of Ascents are a group with a story, and I wasn't the first person to say that. There were other people who had been saying that for a few years before, Émile Bocon and people like that. So I began to study the whole book of Psalms in depth, and at first I was all at sea, and I couldn't make any head nor tail of it. I was reading form criticism and Mowinckel's enthronement ceremony and all that stuff, but it all seemed irrelevant to what I was looking for. And then John Gibson, my first supervisor, said to me, "Why don't you look at the imagery of the Psalms?" So I did. And several things came out of that. The first was there was a sequence of gathering motifs. Now, this was, Gowan had already pointed out that gathering was an important feature of Old Testament eschatology. So I was interested to see this in the Psalms. And sometimes Israel are gathered to Jerusalem, sometimes the nations gather to attack Jerusalem, and then Israel gather to worship in Jerusalem. And then I also found that the Psalms were not just about David. In fact, there was a whole patch in the middle of the Psalms that was more interested in Joseph, the patriarch, than it was in David. So these things reinforced my feeling that there was some kind of story, some kind of meta-narrative in the Psalms, but I still couldn't figure what was going on. Now, around this time, I read 4 books that helped me to clarify my thinking on the whole matter. And I suppose these 4 books were key to the whole thing. 7 years before I began my research, a US scholar, Gerald Wilson, published a book called The Editing of the Hebrew Psalter. Now, Wilson did 2 things. He devoted a lot of attention to the layout of the Psalms. He showed that the collection was not just a random anthology, but that it was structured. And then he concluded that the big story of the Psalms was that the house of David had failed and was finished, and it was kaput. And from now on, Israel must trust in God alone. And therefore, the Psalms were a kind of historical oratorio, like Mendelssohn's Elijah. So that was Wilson. The next book was by a late 19th century Aberdonian whom nobody had ever heard of. And I found his book in the Edinburgh Library, and since that day, I don't think I've ever heard anybody quote him. But this book was by this Aberdonian John Forbes, and I picked this up. And John Forbes was pointing out, and he's writing about the same time as Franz Delitzsch, who Franz Delitzsch was beginning to say, look, there's links between Psalms. But Forbes pointed out that the Psalms that seem to talk about the Messiah are placed at pivotal points in the book of Psalms. And he concluded that this shows, and he said the Psalms must have been redacted after the Babylonian exile when there was no king. So why would they still be featuring these big Psalms about the king when there was no king? They must be looking for the Messiah. And he concluded that the book of Psalms was about the Messiah. The third book was by a Russian Messianic Jew, David Baron. And he, again, about the same time as John Forbes, so late 19th, early 20th century. And he pointed to the Talmudic teaching that the Psalms, the Hallel Psalms, Psalms 112 to 118, would be the songs that the Israelites would sing when the Messiah came to redeem them. Well, that made sense to me. And then the fourth book was 10th century. It was the book of Doctrines and Beliefs by the 10th century Rabbi Sa'adja ibn Yusuf al-Fayumi Gaon. And he says that in the last days, Sa'adja says that two messiahs will appear to deliver Israel. And the first will be the Messiah from Joseph, who will make war against Israel's enemies, but will die in the battle. But his death will bring about forgiveness for the Israelites. And then the second Messiah will be Messiah ben David, who will raise Messiah ben Yosef and rule the world from Zion. And Sa'adja emphasized that all these ideas, this whole eschatological program, with several Messiah figures doing different things in order, that this whole program all arose from the prophets, and particularly from Zechariah. And I looked into it, and it became clear to me that Zechariah does indeed speak of a Joseph-like Messiah. And I was using another book by this time, a book by somebody called M.C. Black, about the suffering and dying Messiah of Zechariah. Black's book is very good. But it's a very rare book. I've hardly ever seen it since. And Zechariah does indeed speak of a Joseph-like figure who dies for the salvation of Israel. And then I found out there is this big rabbinic tradition that recognizes this too, the tradition about Messiah ben Yosef. So this began to explain to me why Joseph was such an important theme in the middle of the Psalms. So I had all these ideas brewing in my mind. And you know, the mind does its own work. You sleep and you rise, and you sleep and you rise, and things begin to connect. And in the end, I saw, okay, Zechariah's eschatological timetable, the one that Sa'adja Gaon talks about, it seems to be lying behind what is going on in the book of Psalms. And so the idea is that the Messiah will come and gather Israel, and he will set up a kingdom, but then he will be killed, and Israel will be scattered. But then the Messiah, or another Messiah, will reappear, and he will destroy Israel's enemies. He will set up his kingdom. He will gather all the nations to worship in Zion, and that will give that. That is when the Messianic kingdom is fulfilled. So I sort of agreed with Wilson about the structure of the Psalms. That was clear to me. And Wilson's evidence made it clearer. But I disagreed totally with his view that the house of David was finished. It was completely at odds with the Bible. It was completely at odds with all Jewish literature. It was completely at odds with all Christian literature. No one ever said the house of David is finished. They all said the Messiah, the son of David, is coming. And this was true all through the Second Temple period. It's true all through the period after the destruction of Jerusalem. Everybody's expecting the Messiah to come. And when I looked at the narrative of the book of Psalms, I just saw the same thing. The Psalms narrative moves through these sequence of troubles and reverses until the appearance of this hero like David, who sets up his throne in Zion. He gathers and saves Israel and receives the homage of all the nations. So I agreed with Wilson that the book of Psalms was an oratorio, but contrary to Wilson, I said it's not a historical oratorio like Elijah. It is an eschatological oratorio like Messiah.
Yeah, that's great. It's fascinating to hear kind of the background and context of you coming into it. Can you kind of flesh out a little bit more on particular evidences that you find for there being an eschatological kind of overarching meta narrative behind the redaction and the organization of the Psalter?
Well, like I said, these 4 books I spoke about, or 5 if we include Black's book, they were the ones that really made it that gave the basic seeds of the idea that was crystallizing in my mind. But if I was wanting to point to several to other sort of the pieces of evidence one at a time, I think I would talk about 5 things. I think I would talk about the overarching mood of the Psalms, the function of the introductory Psalms, the thematic progress of the Messianic Psalms, Israel being scattered in the desert, and then the ingathering sequences. Now, that's 5 things. Let me deal with them one at a time. So let's start with number 1. There are 2 introductory Psalms. If we leave them aside for the moment, the book of Psalms begins at Psalm number 3. And the beginning of the book of Psalms is all about trouble and distress. Yes, there are some happy moments like Psalm 8 and Psalm 19, but a lot of it is about enemies. Enemies this, enemies that. My enemies are troubling me. My enemies want to kill me. God, judge my enemies. And this goes on the whole way through the Psalms. Israel is in trouble. King David is in trouble. Everybody's in trouble. But suddenly when you get to about Psalm 100, things begin to brighten up. And there is talk of victory and salvation. And then the whole book closes with this big hallelujah chorus. So there's clearly a story moving from trouble through to triumph and praise. So that's the overarching mood. Now, the next thing is that the first 2 Psalms stand apart from the rest of the collection. They are like the 2 pillars at the entrance to the temple, and they form a gateway to everything else that will follow. The first Psalm tells us about a righteous king who will ultimately triumph in due season, but the language and the imagery recalls Joseph the patriarch and his son Joshua ben Nun. The second Psalm, however, is different. It tells us that Jehovah's anointed king will reign on Zion, and because he is going to reign on Zion, he must be David's son. Yet the more we look at these 2 pillars as we enter the book of Psalms, the more we find that the central figure in both Psalms seems to be the same person. He is a righteous king who loves the law of the Lord. He is a messianic king, but in Psalm 1, he is a second Joshua, and in Psalm 2, he is a second David. And this is important for the narrative to come. Now, the third thing is there is the progression of the messianic Psalms within the collection. In the introduction, the 2 introductory Psalms, we learn that this righteous king will ultimately rule. And then once we get into the storyline, he appears in Psalm 45, and he comes like a bridegroom to daughter Zion. And then there's more troubles and more reverses, but in Psalm 72, we look forward to his rule over all the nations. And we're told how he will rule from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. But this is not immediate, because in Psalm 89, it seems like the Messiah dies. The words are, you have rejected your Messiah, you have pierced his crown in the dust. Where, O Lord, is your great love that you promised to David? Psalm 89, the Messiah dies, breaking all the promises, apparently breaking all the promises made to David. And the psalmist is in despair at this. This is the great crux of the Psalter. How come the Messiah, to whom all the promises have been made, can die? But then just 3 Psalms later, we have Psalm 92, and it's full of imagery and language about the Joseph Messiah and resurrection language. It seems like this suffering Messiah lives again. And then in Psalm 110, the Messiah appears as the priest king Melchizedek from the right hand of God, and he comes to conquer the earth. And then in Psalm 132, he finally takes his throne to rule the whole earth from Zion. And then after another short reversal in Psalm 140, thereabouts, he triumphs finally in Psalm 144, and then the whole collection closes with songs of praise. Now, another theme is that after the Messiah dies, Israel seemed to be scattered. So Psalm 90 is Moses' prayer over the Israelites perishing in the wilderness. Psalm 91 is a prayer of protection for people in the wilderness, and this ties exactly with what we find in Zechariah's timetable in chapter 13, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. After the Messiah dies, Israel are to be scattered. All the rabbis realized this. In the Messiah ben Yosef traditions, they said that after Messiah ben Yosef dies, Israel will be scattered. So fifth, there are the sequences of ingathering that I spoke about. In Psalm 50, Jehovah calls Israel to gather to himself. After the Messiah appears, and after the Messiah first appears in Psalm 45, Israel are gathered in Psalm 50. And then in the Psalms of Asaph, all the nations gather against Israel. And then finally, Israel gathers together with the nations to worship the Lord of hosts in Mount Zion. And I tie this right back to the Baal cycle, because we see this same sequence of ingatherings in the Baal cycle, but we also see it in the apocalyptic literature of Rabbinic Judaism. We see it in Saadia Gaon's narrative. We see it in the apocalyptic midrashim of the Byzantine period. There is this idea in Israel there will be a continual sequence of ingatherings to Jerusalem, wars, conquests, scatterings, and a final ingathering for all the nations to worship on Mount Zion. And that's what we see in the Songs of Ascents. So these were 4 particulars that would point to eschatology in the book of Psalms. I guess you need to take my whole argument altogether, but that's a condensed version of it.
David, that's excellent. That's really helpful. Of course, a lot of the materials in your book, and I really want to suggest to the listeners, if you haven't obtained a copy, if you've never looked through it, it's an excellent read, and it's very insightful. Again, I still read a psalm a day, and it still informs the way I kind of structure what's going on in my head, as some of the ideas that you brought forth. I remember another point for me was, again, as a young man, reading the Psalms and reading Psalms like Psalm 25. And, of course, when you're a young man, and I was a teenager at the time, and I had all the teenager things going on in my head, and everything was more emotional than it needed to be, and so I immediately related to the Psalms of David, because he felt like an emotional teenager like me in some ways, because I was reading him that way. And then I remember that what really struck me, that made, at least initially, made me think, I don't think I'm reading these properly, was the end of Psalm 25, when David, it sounds like, my bummed out teenager David was talking about his enemies, and he's waiting for the Lord's salvation all day, and he's just got lots of trouble, and by the time I reached the end, the concluding prayer in verse 22 was, Redeem Israel, O God, out of all of its troubles. And I remember realizing, I don't think these Psalms of David are about what I thought that they were. I think that there's a redaction that really has to do with this. This is the hope of the Psalms. And like you said, of course, Wilson's suggestion is one of the reasons it doesn't seem tenable at all. This is because the hope of the Psalms is about the Messiah and ultimately about the redemption of Israel in context to the Messiah's appearing. So that I found very helpful. And several other points as you were talking, I was remembering a lot of the content of the book, and it was bringing me back. So that was great.
You know, all the books of the Bible, we do not know how many hands they've passed through when they come to us. I think something like the prophecy of Obadiah or Nahum probably come to us the way they left the prophet's hand. But some of the bigger books are much more complicated. And the Psalms, more than any other, announces right from the beginning that it's kind of a multi-author work. There's Psalms by Asaph, there's Psalms by David, there's Psalms by Solomon, there's Psalms by Moses, there's Psalms by the sons of Korah. And the Songs of Ascents are apparently by somebody else. And then there's Psalms with no title. So we have this multi-author work. Some of them appear to be very old. Psalm 136, the whole narrative story there finishes in the time of Joshua. So it doesn't mention David, it doesn't mention Zion, it doesn't mention the kingdom of Israel. That's a very old psalm. But some of them, the latest of them, mention the Babylonian exile. So Psalm 137, right next door, talks about the Babylonian exile. So we've got a period of almost 1,000 years over which the Psalms have been written. Somebody took them and put them together. And I suppose the best evidence is that it was in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And who exactly did it, we don't know, but I think it's quite likely that Ezra did it. But Ezra must have been a busy guy, because he is the one who ultimately compiles the whole of our Old Testament. He's the one that brings it together and puts it in its finished form. But whoever it was redacted all these Psalms to point to the hope of Israel, which is the coming of the Messiah and his kingdom. And they didn't do it randomly. They did it with some kind of underlying story. And that story, I suggest, is the story that is the full fruit of the prophets, which is the narrative we find in Zechariah. Now you say, why Zechariah? Well, because Zechariah is the blossom of the prophets. The earlier prophets are revolutionary. Isaiah and Jeremiah, what they produce is revolutionary. But Zechariah comes and takes it all and synthesizes it into a narrative. He takes the suffering Messiah of Isaiah. He takes parts of Ezekiel. He takes the whole structure of and makes it into a narrative of what is going to happen. And this is why Zechariah is going to be the book that underlies, should be the book that is the book that underlies the message of the Psalter.
Well, David, it has been a thrill and a privilege to have you today and to hear how you've not only devoted your scholarship and studies to the Psalms, but to your life, to the practical application of what the Psalms beckon disciples of Jesus to do, right? Which is to praise the Lord, to thank him, to laud him, to worship him through prayer and song. And so I think in our next episode with you, we'd love to gather some of your knowledge on how themes of the Psalter would have been seen and pressed forward in Second Temple literature and in the New Testament. But thank you so much, David, for your time today, and we look forward to our next episode with you. Listeners, we hope this has been encouraging and edifying. Join us again next time on the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. God bless, and Maranatha.
Maranatha.
Shalom.
Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.